Hello and welcome to the Racial Equity webinar series. I'm Kinkini Banerjee, the Coalition Relations Director at USBC, and I'm so glad to have you join us for this session. The USBC hosts this bi-monthly webinar series with funding support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the purpose of this series is to increase our collective understanding about the principles and practice of social and racial justice, equity and inclusion, and strengthen our capacity to implement policies and practices that improve access, dignity, equity, and justice. The ability to work with issues of race and power is a crucial component of leadership, and this is where we engage with some of the most complexity and ambiguity. Our webinars are designed for participants at various levels of knowledge, awareness, and readiness to apply an equity mirror and lens to our work. So as you've seen with our previous topics as well, we bring you a range of topics to help advance our work in reproductive health and justice. So using the equity mirror in our definition of, in USBC's definition of equity, we use the term equity mirror, which helps us view ourselves and our organizations or our coalitions, and examining our own internal systems and structures and culture. And the equity lens, when we talk about that, is again our ability to look outwards and look at our strategy, look at the change that we want to seek, name and understand the systemic oppressions and their impacts. So using both of these, the inward-looking perspectives as well as the external, we hope that it builds our collective capacity to design more impactful programs and policies. So I hope you are a member of our racial equity learning community. This community is a forum to discuss, again, issues of structural and institutional racism within the reproductive health and justice field, and also share resources and ideas. So if you are not already part of this community, please consider joining today. And the inclusive learning process is free and open to anyone in the field. So we have a webinar like we do at each odd-numbered month. We have a moderated discussion forum. We have a very rich file library with general readings that we keep updating with new resources as they come in. And so the discussion forum is also a great way for us to receive and get resources from peers in the field. And we also occasionally do blog posts and highlight the work of other organizations that are happening. So this learning community is, we hope, is a really good resource for our network, and we hope you will consider joining. So the URL for that is www.usbreastfeeding.org/equity-community, and I can show you how to get there. So when you go to our homepage, usbreastfeeding.org, you'll see that bit about the tabs across the top. Click on the News and Info tab, and it'll open up all of the different learning communities. And we have more than 20 different learning communities based on topics, and the racial equity is one of them. We know that many of our registered participants are not able to attend a session live. So we record all of the sessions and post them in on the archives page. I'm just seeing there's how's the audio? Can you all hear me clear? Okay.
Yes.
So the record. Yeah. All right, thanks. The recording with the handouts are on the webinar page, and again, I'll show you how you can get to that page. Again, go to our website, click on coalitions, and the drop-down menu will show you all the different webinar series that we have. We have the CDC USBC hosted 222, our Power Tools for Coalitions, and our Racial Equity. So if you click on the Racial Equity webinar, you should be able to see the slides for today's. We'll be posting other resources as well as you can access the archives from our previous webinars as well. So during today's session, because we have a large number of participants, we do have everybody in listen-only mode when you join in. However, despite the virtual format, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So our speaker will be pausing during the presentation to take questions as well. And please share your comments, insights, questions during the session. And you can type them in your questions box, and if we can, we might even be, if you use the raise hand function, we might even be able to unmute your line. So you should see the control panel on the right of your screen. If you don't see it, it might be minimized. So click on that orange tab with the white arrow, and that control box will pop back out. So if you scroll down just below the audio section is the tab for questions. Click on that tab and it'll open a box for you to type in. So chat us if you want your lines to be open, and we might be able to do that, but otherwise, if you prefer, do use the questions to send us your comments throughout the session. During today's session, if you have any audio or tech-related problems, please email office@usbreastfeeding.org, and our helpful staff should be able to assist you and troubleshoot. And that brings me to today's topic, Leading for Racial Equity. We'll be talking about organizational culture today, which is a very powerful force, deeply ingrained, operating all around us and often invisible. And we'll learn how organizational culture and leadership culture are so closely tied and play a vital role in the success or failure of an organization's mission. Leadership exists in context, and as we think about leadership development, we need to think about it in terms of our own coalition or organization's evolution. What is our coalition's role? What is our stance? Who leads? Are we proactively refining our strategy and direction? Are we adapting our organization culture and systems to our strategy, evolving strategy? And so leadership transitions or leadership development are seen as a larger part of how our own organization is evolving, and what kind of, as networks, as coalitions and networks, we tackle more complex and adaptive issues. We are increasingly thinking about what kind of leadership do we need as we work in this increasingly networked manner. And so today we'll be exploring models that enhance deeper diffusion of authority and accountability. And so we'll be talking about the shared leadership model and what the principles of this model is. We'll also hear about MAG, or the Management Assistance Group, which align their leadership model to their evolving business and strategic direction. So this is a great session to learn about how vital intentional leadership development is if we want to lead oneself, we want to lead with others, lead our own organizations, and also lead the field and create truly leaderful movements. I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Elissa Perry, who is the co-director of Management Assistance Group. Elissa, along with Susan Misra. Elissa brings a wealth of experience as a staff member, board member, consultant, and coach with several individuals, organizations, and initiatives in the areas of leadership, youth development, and arts. And many of you are familiar with Ms. Perry's work in leadership development. Elissa co-creates at MAG. Elissa co-creates opportunities for learning among the staff with values-aligned partners. She synthesizes the learning and shepherds the sharing of learning tools and outcomes. Elissa also teaches a graduate leadership program at St. Mary's College, facilitating diverse cross-sector, multi-issue learning communities in developing and implementing leadership plans. And so we've been following Elissa's work and her writings for a while now, and what really brings to light is how, with such facile, Elissa, you bring together theory and real-world practice and that is so centered in human dignity, interdependence, and justice. So if you haven't, I'll be putting some links in the chat box, but Elissa is the co-author of Doing More with More, Lessons from a Shared Leadership Initiative, published in the Nonprofit Quarterly. She's also written Towards Complex Adaptive Philanthropy, Preliminary Learnings from the Network Leadership Innovation Lab. You've written about leadership and race, how to develop leadership that contributes to racial justice, and also is the lead author on the Network Leadership Innovation Lab, a practice for social change, which is the latest edition of the Handbook of Action Research. So we'll be putting the links for all of this in the chat box. But as part of USBC's commitment to our own professional development, 3 of our staff members participated in the Leadership Learning Community's open space event last year. And Amelia, Sarah, and Danae heard Elissa speak at this transformational event, and it's been transformational for them and vicariously for us as members of the staff as well, because we've heard so much and we've really wanted to adapt and adopt many of the learnings that have emerged from there. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Elissa.
All righty. I am glad to be on the line with you all. Thank you so much, Kankini, and to everyone who showed up and who contributed to making this possible. That's a lot to live up to. You set a high bar for me today. But we're definitely going to jump in. So I will share my screen in 1 second, maybe 2 seconds. All right, I see a main screen and we'll go to that view. So yeah, before I jump into content, I'll just say a little more about myself that is a little more personal, only because when we do race equity work, one of the beginnings is to really bring our whole self into the room, right? So not just our professional publications that in certain contexts might mean something about us, but in other contexts, people couldn't care less, right? So how do we bring our whole selves into the room in all of the things that we value about ourselves, not just what's valued by an artificial system that is meaningful and is important, but isn't all of us, right? So I am a former teacher, a high school teacher. I am someone who identifies as Black and as Choctaw and as queer and also as a geek. I come from a family of healers in many different definitions of what that word means. My father's a pharmacist, my stepmother's a doctor, my mother is a retired preschool teacher and current doula and infant massage therapist and pregnancy massage therapist. My brothers and sisters-in-law are also in healings, spanning from another pharmacist to an acupuncturist and herbalist, so all over the place. I also consider the work that I do healing. I think that any kind of development, personal development, leadership development, organizational development, network development is actually about remembering what it is to be fully human and what it is to be humane, right? So healing some of the rifts, the patterns, the habits that we've gotten into that keep us from that full expression of humanity and human dignity for ourselves and for each other. So that's a little bit more about me and where my perspectives and my stance comes from. I want to start with a short quote for you all. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to read the whole thing. I will tell you that there's a book that I refer to a lot, and maybe we can also add that to the chat. that's called Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's by a woman by the name of Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she is a scientist and an indigenous woman to the northeastern region of, what we call the United States now. And the book is about how she reconciles, integrates indigenous and ancestral ways of knowing and developing knowledge with her scientist's mind and background, which can feel at odds a lot of times to her. But a part of living in a way that honors equity and that feels liberating and liberated is about finding the integration between indigenous ways and her love of science. So I highly recommend this book. But one of the things she talks about is how we focus so much on a Bill of Rights. And when we look at how things in the natural world, as well as indigenous communities, and we're all indigenous to somewhere, just some of us are closer to our indigeneity than others. But in indigenous communities and many communities of color, there's more of an unspoken list of responsibilities, right? So think about if we interacted with one another as if we were coming from our bill of responsibilities. And that can include responsibilities to ourselves and our families, but also responsibilities to community and for each other and for collective well-being, as opposed to a Bill of Rights, which keeps us in a really individual place, right? So I'm just going to ask us to hold that frame of being in a bill of responsibilities, coming to racial equity from our sense of responsibility for the collective whole. And with that, I will move into the slide deck. So at MAG, we have, through our work, MAG's been around since 1980. And I've been with MAG for 5.5 years. And in the last 3 years, really, we have started to name what are really the 5 sort of key elements. Of course, there are other things that contribute, but what are the real key elements that contribute to a thriving, just ecosystem, right? And the 5 things that we lifted up, and we did so in partnership with many other folks who do this work, as well as from our work with thousands of clients over the years since that time. And we named cultivating leaderful ecosystems. I know that's a lot of jargon. We couldn't find shorthand for that that was accessible. If you have ideas, you can put those in the chat box. But cultivating leaderful ecosystems, elevating inner work, influencing complex systems change, advancing deep equity, and engaging multiple ways of knowing. So those are a lot of words. I'm happy to talk about any of them. The 2 we're going to talk about most today are cultivating leaderful ecosystems and advancing deep equity. And if folks want to know anything about what the other ones mean, or even just a short explanation of what they are, I'm happy to answer that. Just make the request as a question. So going a little bit deeper into deep equity, we often talk about racial equity and liberation, and we center race when we're talking about equity, and we bring an intersectional lens. So it's about race and gender, race and immigration. Yeah, all of those things, race and healthcare, right? All of it. So we have a core focus on that. And then within that, if we think about what are the systems or practices of oppression, and you'll see them on your screen there. This work was developed by Monica Dennis. And those things are disconnection from source, a disassociation from the body, distancing of emotions, and a distortion of story. I'm not going to go into all of those things and how those happen. And if we think only about the dissociation from body and the distortion of story, we can see how breastfeeding has been impacted by systems of oppression. There are ways from which we are cut off from natural processes and natural things that happen with our bodies, right? That are storied in a way in our culture and in public spaces that have an impact on women and have an impact on children, and because of that have an impact on all of us, right? If we look at the flip side, whoops, what just happened? Oh, there we go. Somehow that took me out of my own slides. If we think about the flip side, which is systems of liberation, we can see reclaiming body, restoring story, right? So an equity practice actually around breastfeeding, really sharing data and research and numbers and scientific reasoning for health and all of that is super duper important. And how are we restoring the story? What stories are told? I know people create videos, people create images for how things are done, or to learn more about the process itself, right? So that more people have access to the practice and to information. But how are we actually retelling the story in a way that gets us into a practice of liberation, right? So I'm just giving you some examples as we talk about those systems of oppression and liberation. And when we say deep equity in race and, sometimes people think, and you all may have talked about this already on a previous webinar, but I always find it's helpful to ground people in the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? So diversity is more numbers, simply higher numbers of people who are different than whatever has been the norm. Then inclusion of more voices, right, means that there's actually a way of listening and incorporating feedback and actually shifting some things. That requires some culture change for there to be inclusion. And then when we talk about equity and deep equity, and those voices actually have impact, and there is systems level change as well as individual behavior change based on those voices and that impact, then we're talking about equity, and that is deep culture change. That's a whole other level. And for us, the relationship between equity and liberation is that liberation is the goal for everyone, for all of us. And that doesn't mean that everyone has exactly the same thing, but everyone has what they need to show up as their best self and participate in the world as they want to participate in the world, right? So if liberation is our goal, based on where we are now and that vision of liberation, equity is the bridge, right? So we're aiming for equity on our way to liberation. So what does this white dominant culture look like in our organizations when we talk about systems of oppression? And we talk about them as systems of oppression or practices of oppression from that previous slide, because they are systems, right? It's not just an individual person's behavior. And we can have organizations that are full of people, filled with people who have excellent, amazing intentions and would never intentionally do anything that is upholding a system of oppression, or intentionally upholding or elevating white dominant culture. And it still happens because it's been in place for hundreds of years, and we have not figured out how to lift it up, name it, work with it productively, as lightly and as seriously as the context allows and requires and calls for, and move to something else. So the characteristics on this slide are not all of the characteristics, and I can share the article. This comes from research that was done by Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones. Tema Okun is a white Jewish woman. Kenneth Jones was a Black man. He's since passed on. But these are some of the ones that show up frequently. One of them is either or thinking, right? So either something is good or bad, someone or something is racist or not. Someone is, things are black and white, so to speak, right? So either or thinking. An equity promoting culture has a value of simultaneity, right? We can in that context, we can understand nuance. We can understand that even I, who am a fair-skinned Black woman, can show up simultaneously exercising a behavior that is upholding a system of oppression because I have light skin privilege, right? And I'm educated. So I might be showing up in behaviors that someone who has less formal education or is darker skinned might experience as an oppressive behavior, right? And at the same time, be myself experiencing racism in that same context, right? Depending on what context we're in. So it's all simultaneously happening. It's all, and someone can be both a good person and do something that's racist, right? That's simultaneity. Another characteristic of white dominant culture is power hoarding. And power hoarding doesn't necessarily mean, someone like sitting in their office barricaded thinking about how am I gonna get all the power and hold all the power and not share it with anyone, and might think of them having an evil laugh in their corner office that's on some high floor, right? That's not necessarily what we're talking about. Power hoarding can also show up as not having information be easily shareable or accessible, right? So it can be really unintentional. It can mean talking about things in language that's inaccessible. It can mean, what else can power hoarding mean? It can mean maintaining practices that uphold the existing power structure rather than being open to changing the power structure, right? So systems and policies are in place to uphold the existing power structure, which will unintentionally or intentionally continue to perpetuate oppression. So what's the opposite of that? Power sharing. This is where shared leadership comes in. Now, when Susan, who's my co-director, and I became co-directors almost 3 years ago to the day, we were very intentional with our board that we didn't just want to bring in a model, a structure that is two people sharing the co-executive director role, but that we wanted to shift our culture to a culture of shared leadership, meaning that good ideas can come from anywhere, that people should have the resources and space to exercise leadership in the way that is appropriate for their role. And in order to do that, we have to share information, make information accessible, make decision-making accessible. And that doesn't mean that everyone's involved in every decision. It means decision-making is clear, that it doesn't happen in an opaque box, that people know when and where they can have input. They know who is making the final decision, even if it's not them. It's transparent, right? So that's the opposite of power hoarding. Fear of open conflict, right to comfort, that's another one. So this idea that people have a right to safety, but that's very different than comfort. And a lot of times people assume a right to be comfortable. And so there's an assumption that people of color are just going to have to be uncomfortable if they are not comfortable in a context that is white dominant. Another, the opposite of that is having an orientation that's about generative tension, right? So it's okay if hard things come up, if we don't disagree, if we don't agree, and we can work with that in a way that's generative and have constructive conversation. We give feedback to each other in a way that is supporting each other's growth and learning. And we listen to and hear that feedback with that orientation as much as possible. Another one is defensiveness. So defensiveness can show up in a really angry, like repelling something way, or defensiveness can also just show up as hiding behind rules, hiding behind regulations, and not focusing on the impact, right? So that focusing on the impact, which is on the right side there, means not getting stuck in intention. So oftentimes when there is something that could lead to conflict, right? When there is something that's raised, someone does say, hey, you know, I observed that you did this and it made me feel this way. Defensiveness can show up. And in that defensiveness, sometimes people will focus on intention, but this is what I meant. And this is what I was trying to do. And this is where I'm coming from. And this is my experience. And that is all very true and valid, but it doesn't acknowledge the impact or show any sort of commitment to changing behavior so that that same impact won't happen again. Or won't happen in the same way, right? So there's no commitment to anything being different. There's only a sense of protection of one's own ego, which is totally understandable. None of us will want to be wrong. None of us want to hurt people, or at least I think we don't want to hurt people. We don't want to, cause harm, and we don't want to be thought of as bad. We don't want to be thought of as racist. We don't want to be thought of as sexist. We don't want to be thought of as any of those things. So it's natural to be defensive, and it doesn't help us because it maintains a culture of white dominance. So a next one is intellectualism. And intellectualism means only valuing academic ways of knowing. Academic knowing is important. I teach in a college. We publish a lot of stuff in MAG, right? I went to 13 years of Catholic school. I have a master's degree, like I can do intellectualism. You heard all my jargon earlier. And there are many ways of knowing that are just as true, valid, important. And if we only listen to one and prioritize one all the time, we're leaving so much knowing on the table, and we're leaving out a lot of cultural ways of knowing and practicing and living life and doing things that teach us a whole lot, right? That have a whole lot for us. So when we talk about multiple ways of knowing, we're talking about creativity, we're talking about artistic ways of knowing, ways of knowing that come from the land, like Robin Wall Kimmerer and Breeding Sweetgrass is talking about. We're talking about ancestral wisdom, stories that have been passed down for generations on how to do something, how to swaddle a baby even, right? Those kinds of things actually don't need intellectual knowing to explain them, right? So we can learn a lot. Now, the last thing I want to say about this table is that this is actually a spectrum, and I am not in any way saying that the things on the left, right, the either or thinking, power hoarding, that column, are all inherently bad. What's bad is when they are habits. This column is also talked about as habits of white dominant culture. So that's the default cultural norm of an organization or an institution. There are times when it might be perfectly the right thing to do to make a choice to be an either or thinking, or make a choice to be defensive, right? If you're an obstetrician and you're thinking about malpractice insurance, right? Defensiveness might be the correct stance to be in your mind. And if that's the default, we're losing out a lot, right? So it's about, so these things are on a spectrum across the rows of the table. And the bad thing is when they're habits. We want to be choiceful about where we're showing up on the spectrum and build our capacity and build our know-how to show up more on the right side, show up in simultaneity and power sharing, and being able to hold generative tension and committed to growth and learning, focusing on impact, not just intentions, and embracing multiple ways of knowing. I'm just checking on my time here. All right. So what it can look like. This is just one story, and I am going to read from my slide, even though you can probably all read for yourself. This came from a woman that we worked with who was in a large foundation. And she said, instead of just believing us when we, the two people of color in the foundation and the grantees of color, told them something is hurting people of color communities, my colleagues in the foundation commissioned a 3-year report to count things, measure stuff, and tell them what we already told them. Then when the foundation was ready to start 4 years after we told them, we were starting from an even deeper place of negative trust. More communities had seen greater harm, and I was working double and triple time to bridge and build. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are questions, comments, requests.
Thank you, Elissa. And yes, we do have some comments here. I'm going to open that out. And it's Ruth says, it's interesting to see so much in our field is about documenting in an academic way, you know, how families instinctively have other ways of knowing as well. But that worship of as folks of color, often in an organization, we can be canaries in the coal mine, and we can you've heard of folks who talk about things, but unless sometimes it's read in the Stanford Social Innovation Review or some paper publishes it, then it gains traction or folks hear it. So you hear that a lot too from when you ask, how are you heard? How are these voices heard in this policy spaces?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that might be a thing to think about, right? So how, for example, with the policy group within USBC, engage family wisdom as an equity practice, right? As a practice of reconnecting to story, retelling story, restoring story, right? That liberation practice.
Yeah. And in our work, we've been doing a lot of story collection right now. We work with our partners like Moms Rising, but really hearing in the advocacy work that we do, not being the ones to collecting the voices has just been a commitment in our equity journey as well. So I'm going.
Yeah. So maybe like a next step or a next level would be creating practices of participatory action research.
Nice.
Where, yeah, right. So where that story project is actually engaging them in the collection and synthesis and lifting up what's important. Any other questions or comments?
One question here is, how do you measure you know, how you're making a difference. So there's a whole evaluation question out there, is that sometimes we do things and we can check box what we've done, but measuring if we are making a difference. So how do you conduct evaluation when measuring program or policies efficacy? Uh,
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to assume that the question is, how does the race equity work make a difference?
right.
Okay, so what we do, we rely a lot on our clients actually, but in general for ourselves, so we have an understanding of what clients look like at a sort of, and partners, right? So it's not just clients, but clients and partners look like at a kind of 101 level, right? Where they might just be embarking on their 101 journey, a 202 level, and a 303 level. And these are just shorthand for, what it looks like as or people, organizations, networks progress on their racial equity journey. So we start every engagement with a listening process so that we can mirror back to the group, and the group can see and have a shared understanding of what the experience is regarding racial equity in the group. That's done through a combination of interviews, focus groups, surveys, looking at printed material, sometimes talking with board, sometimes talking with their members or their partners that they work with, right? To get kind of a picture. And those questions are all rooted in understanding the current culture with a race equity lens. So then after we've worked with them for a while, right, we can see how they're doing in those same areas that were lifted up in the report. And so the things with partners are sometimes self-reports because we don't always go back out to their partners in their communities. And but we do get additional follow-up information from staff and from board.
Excellent.
So,
Thank you. And
yeah.
yeah, so important to do that kind of, authentic engagement
Mm-hmm.
of the community. We have one more question.
I was just going to
If you
say,
have time for that?
yeah, should we take one more and then I can keep
Sure.
continuing? Okay.
This is about a white dominant culture, and for most of the work that our coalitions, as well as our that we do in the USPC space, is having multiple organizations come together and collaborate. And what is the best way to call out or call in when organizations perpetuate the white dominant ways of doing things? How do we challenge this within our own leadership as individuals?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad whoever asked this question. Thank you. So we share the frame, first of all, with our partners that we're working with, and we model calling ourselves in around it and invite them to call us in when we're showing up in any of these places that are not in service or maybe not appropriate for the context or what we're doing. And as we model it, then other folks get more comfortable at calling themselves in, like noticing in themselves when they're showing up this way, and calling other and being called in, right? And the more we practice, it's really, really awkward and uncomfortable at first. And really, that's at first. Pretty quickly, we get good at it, right? We get good, we get comfortable. We can even laugh when it's an appropriate and okay time to laugh, about what we're showing up. And sometimes it's serious and it's not an appropriate time to laugh, right? But it doesn't have to be the end of the world when someone's called in. So it's about relationship. It's about building trust, and that building relationship and building trust for us usually starts with modeling what it looks like to be vulnerable. and show up with, I learned this from a colleague of ours, Jody Tanita, with humble audacity, right? So last thing I'll say about that that's also important is that, yes, these are characteristics of white dominant culture, but we all in this country are indoctrinated into the characteristics and habits of white dominant culture. I'll tell you one other thing. When Susan and I became co-directors, it was about 9 months later that we read this article together with our staff in a staff retreat. And I'm going to curse, Susan and I were like, oh shit, like we do so many of these things on this. And we are both two women of color. And Susan's also an immigrant, right? So, or a child of immigrants. So, you know, we realize that we're doing this too, right? We're not exempt from this. And so we really had to take a look at that, right? And then we had to recognize that we actually probably got to the positions we're in, being co-executive directors of, you know, a pretty successful, long-standing organization, because we got good at this, right? So, yeah.
So true. Thank you. Very true. And I'm saving humble audacity for use. Thank you, Elissa. Please carry on.
Oh, sure. All right. So I'm going to move us on to leaderful ecosystems. So essentially, every time I minimize my board, my slideshow goes away. There we go. All right. So essentially, leaderful ecosystems is about power sharing. It's about understanding that to change everything, it takes everyone. Ideas at all levels are valued for the potential expertise they represent, right? So expertise isn't only academic knowing, it's also experiential, it's artistic, it's ancestral, it's many things. Ideas from others are requested and space is made for them to be heard. We heard the next step of that also when we talked about participatory action research, that you know, folks may also be creating those spaces, right, and creating the mechanisms for them to be heard. Budgets are made available for viewing and providing input on, and resources are shared equitably and appropriately. So that last one, resources are shared equitably and appropriately, I'll give you a concrete example of what that looks like. So when Susan and I became co-directors, and we said we wanted to shift our culture to one of shared leadership, one of the ways that manifested for us was looking at, well, what are some of our what's our existing budget? What would it look like for our budget to support a culture of shared leadership? Our HR policies, our pay scale, all of that. And one of the things we first noticed, and was kind of like shocking to us, was the gap between the highest paid person on staff and the lowest paid person on staff. And it was like we were really both uncomfortable with that, with what it was. And so we narrowed that gap to be 1 to 3. So at no point, you know, our guideline is that at no point will the person who makes the most on staff make more than 3 times what the lowest person makes. Another thing we did was we shared the budget with all staff, so they know, they can see everything. They can provide input, they can ask questions, but it's very clear that Susan and I are making the decisions and that the board, you know, has the final approval decision-making authority. So that's just one concrete example of what that can look like as far as a policy goes. Going forward, so for the co-directorship, we use a structure that's called first among equals. That's what that thing that looks a little bit like an equation means. And that means that I'm holding whoever's first among equals in a space. So for me, it's the left column. And this is not our entire job description. It's just a few highlights to give you an example. where I am first among equals means that I hold the day-to-day. I move things along. I hold the high-level picture. I know where we are in our strategic directions around this piece. I'm the one talking with our communications person, all of that. Where Susan is first among equals, the same goes with her. And what that means, the among equals part, is that if Susan's on vacation or, on health leave or what have you, I am authorized to make decisions in her column if she's not available. But I don't hold the day-to-day. And our commitment is to inform one another enough, or to at least know where the information lives that we would need to make a decision without the other person. So that's what first among equals means. And then there's a column in the center where we really do make decisions together. And you'll see that a couple things that also indicate the culture of shared leadership. So for example, in the middle column, the top row, under HR and supervision, we defined what supervision means to us. And to us, supervision means growing and supporting one another's superpowers in service of our shared vision. So that's the ethos we bring to supervision. It's not only about, I should say, because people do have goals, it's not only about setting goals and measuring people towards them. That's a part of it. But it's also about growth, right? And growing superpowers in ways that they're bringing their leadership to our shared vision. And in our that supervision model, equity is built into it. So there's an equity pathway from ally to co-conspirator. And not everyone on staff needs to be a co-conspirator. But we do ask that everyone on staff at least be on a path to be an ally, if not already an ally, right? So that means finance, operations, admin, folks who are making decisions about vendors and things like that, even have an ally stance. Our consultants, we would hope, would be, closer to co-conspirators. Yeah, and then the other thing that kind of indicates that shared leadership piece is that there are other folks who are showing up in just these examples who are not near Susan. So they're helping to hold things with us. And there are other places where that's true in our organization as well. Every organization we work with, and there are a lot now, as well as our partners that we learn with and also work with that are using CoDirector models, they all have some set of working agreements or guiding principles that they come back to again and again. These are the ones that Susan and I created when we embarked on this experiment, which is working out rather well for us. Continue to be honest and transparent with each other. I'm not going to go through every single one, but asking rather than making assumptions, like these things, some of these things have really, we have had to lean on them hard. And I'll say that after the 2016 election, no matter who, anyone supported or supports, it was a huge deal for the people we work with, right? Because we work with mostly social change organizations and foundations, philanthropy. Even if they're for-profit models, there are people with some sort of social benefit mission that we work with. So for a lot of those folks, there was just complete pandemonium, chaos, disbelief, sadness, right? And our responses of how to deal with the exponentially higher volume of work and people wanting coaching and people wanting strategy support and people wanting equity processes was really different. And we got out of the habit of being honest and transparent with each other and letting things slide when there were small disagreements or something that maybe rubbed one of us the wrong way. Because of the context we were in, and we were both working really hard, and and when we came back to our agreements, we were like, oh, these are good. There's a reason we have these. And we did bring some stuff to our coach, and it was great. We had constructive conversation, and we didn't have to get to our board chair. Things didn't go to that level. But it was really important that we had these, because it gave us a way to hold that generative tension when we even forgot about being in the habit, right, of holding generative tension and coming from a space of growth and learning. We were just in stress mode. So coming back to the working agreements really helped us to do this. And these are particularly for us, because Susan and I knew each other. And even though we were professional colleagues, we were also very friendly, and we had written the shared leadership article together and maintained a professional friendship for a number of years. So these are very specific to us. So I'm going to, I'll pause again actually, and see if there are any more questions or things around shared leadership people would like to hear more about. And again,
Yes.
sure is really strongly connected to power sharing, which is the habit of an equity culture.
Absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We have one request to put the working agreement slide back, if you can please show that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then, Amelia, did you have anything to add? I have a couple questions here.
Yeah, sure. We have a couple questions. So how can organizations with less racial diversity in leadership and more diversity in junior staff enable a more equitable organizational culture?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just making sure I heard correctly, less people of color in leadership and more in junior positions? Is that
correct?
Okay.
Yep, correct.
Yep. So that's actually a lot of the folks that we work with. That's what the organizational staffing looks like. And what's really needed is someone, at least someone, with a lot of positional leadership who is going to champion and carry the work. Ideally, that's the person with the most positional leadership. The only few times I've seen it to work where the person, the president or CEO or whatever the person is with the most positional leadership hasn't been the champion, but it still worked. They were committed to it happening and were willing to get out of the way so that they weren't keeping it from happening. That's rare. That's rare. So there needs to be someone with a high degree of positional leadership who's willing to carry the work forward and model what that vulnerability means. That person doesn't have to be a person of color. Often it's actually helpful if the person isn't a person of color, right? So because they're making it okay for other people to take risks. It's showing vulnerability at that highest level of power, right? If the person who holds the most power is able to be vulnerable, that's already a setup for power sharing. Is that helpful?
Yes,
Very, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question on how do we, one of our, Sarah, you really liked that chart about your one among equals breakdown and inviting staff, board partners and others to be that. How would you be able to share us that process of how you kind of created that, and with Susan, and the ethos that went into that?
Mm-hmm. So we looked at our strengths and our areas of learning and growth, and started there. And then we also looked at, like, where is it really important for both of our strengths to show up? In places like HR, which is really the sort of policy and structure underneath the culture we want to create, right? How we treat people. It's human resources, right? How is human resources rife with human dignity is something that we should both be holding, right? So we really just took a day. We had a day-long retreat where we came up with our working agreements and our 6-month benchmarks for ourselves, for how we were going to know if we were moving in the right direction. And we shared those benchmarks, our working agreements, and the 3-column description with our board. And they were good with it, and we kept moving. Now it has evolved, so it's not exactly the same as it was when we started out 3 years ago, and it will likely continue to evolve as we calibrate. And also as the needs change and the field changes, there may be different things that we need to pay attention to, or different areas that our strengths would be more helpful in, right? So it could change again.
Thank you. And Elissa, as you said, your staff team has also grown in the time that you and Susan became co-directors. And how are you? That was very powerful, where you said that all of these others, you need at least allyship or co-conspirators. How were you able to communicate that to members of your staff?
Yeah, so we had our staff has grown in the 3 years. We've doubled in size and budget, so staff number and budget. And I believe it was only a few months after we were at our current size, we had an in-person staff retreat that was 2.5 days, and 1.5 of those days was really focused on equity. And we created, Susan led it, and then a couple other of us on staff contributed to it, a deck that we're sharing with you all what we mean by equity and what it means to be on an equity journey at MAG. And we outlined that and also asked for feedback. So it got refined after that staff retreat based on input from staff. And then that journey, right, that was lived in, had been created in a slide deck, was translated into our performance review and supervision model. So that folks have opportunities to grow. They can, think about how they want to use their professional development fund. Everyone has opportunities for professional development in the equity area and or in the other elements too. If folks remember, there were 5 elements we named. But most folks are focusing on equity and inner work right now, because most of us are pretty good at the intellectual knowing of complex systems change. Yeah.
Sure. And I think the point that you made that was so important to underscore here is that this is not just the leadership of the executive team or the directorship. It really is a leadership ethos where you are inviting a more leaderful movement. There is greater sharing of power, understanding of the decision-making criteria. So therefore, the staff, the board, the other stakeholders who are involved, the consultants, are getting that in the context of the larger organizational and leadership ethos as well. So there's change happening for everybody, not just the two people at the top.
Absolutely. And I would say it actually even goes one more fractal out. And by that, I mean that there are other capacity builders, intermediaries in the social change space, like Social Transformation Project and Building Movement Project, Movement Strategy Center, the Interaction Institute for Social Change, right? There's lots of us who have a similar vision and have similar complementary ways of working. And we have all come to the point where we are much more networked and sharing power and resources and doing learning together. Because if we're really all trying to create the same vision, right? If we're all working towards the same goal, which is ultimately dignity for people and planet, it doesn't make sense to compete, right? So
Right.
we all want to shift the world in that way, and there's plenty of work to go around. We're going to get there better and faster with greater integrity and higher quality if we're sharing our learning together, if we are ourselves a community of practice. So it goes a fractal out even to sharing power and learning and leadership in the field across organizational boundaries.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Do we have time for more questions, Elissa? Would you want to continue?
So we could take one more, or even two, maybe. Yeah. And if there are people, if there's something that people would like me to talk more about, I'm happy to do that as well. Something I skimmed over lightly.
Sure. So we see comments. I see leaders still holding power at the top. There is one question about how the shared leadership model, how common is it right now, and also, there are we have the function of having the single hero martyr role, and we like to. There's generally skepticism or risk seen in the shared leadership model, and folks prefer to think that a single person might be less risky. So, what are the upsides of it, and what are the downsides of creating this shared structure?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, that was a lot. So it's becoming more and more common. I would say when Susan and I became co-directors, we interviewed the other co-director teams that we knew, to find out what was working for them, what were drawbacks, what did they wish they had known when they started out, that sort of thing. And there were 6 pairs that we knew that we could reach out to. That number is more like 30 now, right? So I haven't done, a scientific study of how many organizations there are out there with shared leadership structures or models. But I could say there's easily 30 I could reach out to now to interview with those same questions, to find out about their experience. It's increasing exponentially. And Compass Point actually did a piece on shared leadership structures maybe a year ago or so. It was written by Jean Bell, who was their CEO at the time. And they, by the way, have moved to a model of co-directorship now that Jean has stepped out of the CEO role. And it was really interesting that we didn't realize till we were on the call to support her in her research that every single person who was in a co-director model was either a woman or a person of color, and probably 70% of us also identified as queer, which was really interesting. But the fact that there was not one white man was really interesting. Out of all of these organizations, I think there were 12 who had shared leadership structures, which is an anecdotal connection between this idea of power sharing being a more equitable structure than the habits of white dominant culture, which frequently are, we could put that parenthetical phrase in there of habits of white male dominant culture. Yeah, so that was the first part about how common. There was a second part to the question, and I don't remember it now. Can you help me out?
Sure, sure. And it's so interesting. Every day we get a new email that we see about shared leadership happening among our networks, or our Compass Point leadership learning community now is also positioning themselves. So that was that. And how do why? I'm trying to read this now again. It's that why do people think that a shared leadership model is riskier than adopting a single, one rock star leader at the top? Like, why is it seems like an ironic frame to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of that is what people are used to. That it's easier to build a relationship, have communication with, hold accountability with one person. But also, if you look at the expectations and job descriptions of an executive director, it's really like unsustainable. And even if someone can sustain it, it's usually not in a very healthy way. So if we really are caring about someone's well-being, the single executive director model or CEO model is not that, right? So it makes a lot of sense just for that reason. It was interesting that one of the things that Susan shares as one of the things she learned is she kind of thought that it might be less work, and it's not. It's not less work, but it's more different work. I think because of the way we work together and the way things are set up, it's sustainable. And we don't have to hold the stress alone. There's opportunity for more joys, more successes, greater partnership, greater impact, right? We always, say two heads are better than one. Having that kind of consistent thought partnership. And actually, we have a third staff member from our team of, I think we're 13 right now, who has been with MAG for 14 years. And he is on our strategic thinking calls with us, with Susan and I. So the three of us even are holding that together. And I can say without any doubt or hesitation that our thinking, whether it's just the two of us or all three of us, is much deeper, much more impactful, combines all of our strengths in ways that sort of counterbalance each of our growth areas, because we're very different. We have very different strengths and very different growth areas. So that together we are holding the whole with greater capacity to actually get to the whole, right? To actually get to our goals.
Thank you. That's so helpful. We do have one more question, but maybe I can wait until later.
Actually, we can take it now, because the next thing I have is a few reflections for folks.
Okay.
So
Um,
we'll take. Mhm.
so this is someone who works in a more a dominant culture organization and said, can you talk more about staff meeting facilitation and this and navigating that line about the right to comfort versus the right to safety, like kind of understanding that in terms of shared expectations.
Sure. So safety, when we're talking about safety, we're usually talking about basic needs, shelter, food, physical safety, the things that support that, like a paycheck, access to transportation, right? Things like that, health. When we're talking about comfort, we're usually talking about ego threat, threat to our sense of self, threat to our identity, um, threat to our ways of knowing and being that we are comfortable with enough that we don't want to change, right? So basically, at a basic level, that's the difference between comfort and safety. And what's difficult in situations is that our brains don't distinguish between physical threat and ego threat. So we react the same way, right? And when we react, frequently, if it's out of some sort of threat, right, it's a fear reaction or an anger reaction, but generally a fear reaction. And when we're in a fear reaction, we're wired to overestimate threat and underestimate or not even see resource, right? So if you imagine if there's someone in with a position of leadership who also has white skin privilege or maybe male privilege or both, or educational privilege, all of the above, and someone who doesn't share those privileges and maybe more junior, the threats that they're experiencing are really different, but their responses that they're feeling in their bodies and in their emotions are probably the same. So the impacts of them are going to be really different. And if the person in a position of power and people in positions of power could pause and really understand what is the ego threat, or is this really a physical threat, right? Because usually what's at risk for them is not the same. So, for example, one organization that I worked with, which was a white dominant culture organization, they were rife with it. They had grown out of a Christian religious tradition, and they were doing community organizing work, mostly in communities of color, though, but it was a white-led organization. And the executive director was, it was a huge transition for him to understand the difference between ego threat and physical safety threat, and to understand that when he was challenged by a quote junior staff member who was a Black woman, that the risk she was taking was about basic needs, because he could fire her and she wouldn't have a paycheck and she wouldn't be able to pay her rent or eat food, or take care of her 2-year-old child, or make a car payment, or take the bus to get to work, or what have you. And what was at risk for him was his ego and how people thought of him, which as a leader is important, but it's not quite the same as safety, right? And there's different levels of repair and possibility when we're talking about ego threat versus physical threat. So that's the difference. And when we can hold that and invite people into that understanding, even if we don't use that language, right? We do it in ways that are more accessible. Big shifts are possible. So I don't know if that's helpful to you even in understanding the situation. Probably doesn't give you a way forward, but yeah.
No, this is super helpful just in being able to frame it. Thank you. This is great.
All right. So I'm gonna pause. We are close to time. And I'm just gonna switch to the next slide, which are just some reflections. And if folks have any reflections that they want to share in the chat, I'd love to see them. And it went away again. There we go. And the reflection questions, in case anyone can't see. Can people see them now?
We've gone back to your slide deck.
Okay.
Now we see it. Now we see it.
Ugh. Every time I move my control panel, moves out. Sorry about that.
Send your insights and perspectives in, folks.
Elissa, this is Sarah. Do you mind if I read aloud the reflection questions just for accessibility for folks?
Oh, sure. And go for it. Or I can read them out loud.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Move my panel over and pull them up again. So where have you recognized yourself or your organization during this webinar is one. The second one is, what might you want to do differently, or how might you want to be differently? You know, show up in a different stance or paying attention to something differently. And the last one is, what might you need to support that different way of being or doing? And any reflections on any of those questions? Love to see or hear. Or any other questions anyone's holding?
I see. I feel that there are many voices in my organization that are not being held, let alone having an impact. You know, the format in which we interact also is very limiting. Probably in virtual spaces too, because they're spread across a state.
Yeah, a tough one.
Tamika says, thank you for defining educational privilege. I felt it, but could not define it. So thank you. And then we have many other comments saying, wonderful presentation, very helpful. Thank you. One of them says, can you expand on humble audacity?
Sure. So humble audacity, having the courage and enough ego, right, to put things out there, but holding it lightly, right? Doing it in a way that is humble and willing to be wrong and willing to change your mind, right? So sometimes I say strong opinions held loosely.
Lovely, thank you. Angela Love Saranka says, I see the immense value in co-leadership, yet I think it may be a challenge to find another person committed to co-leadership.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. And this is a place where humble audacity comes in to ask. Like, I've been really surprised when folks have asked. You know, a lot of our organizations and networks that we worked with wanted to move to models of co-directorship, and really had a lot of reservations about being able to find someone. And when they put it out there and actually started asking people if they had interest, there was tons of interest. And they did, well, I should say the two that I've worked with recently on that both did find the right match for them.
So there's
Yes.
hope. We need to ask, and we need to. And true to folks in the traditional leadership model, this might seem like a loss at first, that somehow sharing that is less, that the scarcity model is less for one. How would you address that? That it's not half, as you said, or less work, or less, that it's the sum of these two are more than what?
Yes, I'd say it's probably like 75% and 75%. So that what we collectively are contributing to our mission and to the field and to the impact we want to have is much greater than what one person in this role could do. And it's true, there is some loss of power in the ways we think about it traditionally. But I also feel like there's greater power because there is a deeper level of trust, which means the whole organization can do more and do more both efficiently and with spaciousness. And what I mean by that is when there's trust, things can go faster. And there can also be more spaciousness. Like, I trust that will get done because we made a commitment to it. We said who it was assigned to. Like, I can let go of it. So I have more spaciousness for myself, which is greater well-being for me.
Such an important point.
Yeah. So in some ways there is less power, but there's also much greater and deeper power towards impact and towards well-being that make it entirely worth it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have Leslie, who says, we are at a place in our organization where we are attempting to create an org culture that incorporates some of these principles. And it's been so helpful to put into words and images the concepts that we are just beginning to recognize and explore. This session is so helpful. If there's any other readings and resources, please share. And so, Leslie, yes, we will be adding more to that page. And Elissa, if there's anything that you feel beyond, we'll give you the list that we are planning to share. If you want to add to that, that would be great.
Yes, I will be happy to add to it. And I just want to thank the folks who are still on. I know we're at time, so people will be dropping off rapidly. So I just want to thank the folks who showed up and who were able to hang out the whole time. I hope it was useful. And yeah, I'm happy to share whatever.
Great. Thank you so much, Elissa. We are at a time. We have a couple other comments also from folks who are saying that they've been exploring this, distributed authority, decision making, and how useful this has been. So thank you all. And this brings us to the end of today's session. Again, thank you, Elissa, for such an amazing, compelling session and for that nuanced weaving of how, culture, power dynamics, and its impacts. So leadership is not about what we do, but also how we do it. So today's session, I know, has galvanized me, and I hope it's inspired all of us for the internal work that we need to do to engage in if we need to truly make the systems level change. So I'm inviting us all to continue this conversation. The comments keep coming in on our learning community discussion forum. So again, thanks all. Until next time. Thank you, Elissa.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.